you are either straight or you're gay.
Mm-hmm.
You're normal or you're abnormal, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the colonial influence is saying you have to be pinned down,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
We
Mm-hmm.
we don't like messiness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, a lot of what I want to do is to go back to that messiness and to reclaim that messiness and say,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's always been there, right?
Yeah.
It's not so simple, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think a lot of that resistance to colonialism is resisting that simplification,
Yeah.
these simple
Absolutely.
binaries.
Hi, my name's Leo WT, and you have found your way to the Conversations Podcast. Conversations exist to create spiritually minded conversations about life. We desire to create safe space for dialogue and community. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to generate conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Everyone is welcome at the conversation.
What's up, friends? It's Leo WT here with a little pre-recorded episode of Conversations. If you haven't seen the show or heard the podcast before, we do spiritually minded conversations about life on a regular basis, and we encourage intersectionality and spiritual curiosity at every junction. When I say spiritual, I want you to know that it doesn't necessarily mean religious, but it means more than tangible. So you can bring your religious practicalities to the conversation, but we can't limit the conversation because of religious practicalities. How's that sound? But today I have a conversation that I have been really just waiting to have for a super long time, and I'm so pumped to bring it to you. But I want to preface our conversation with a couple of things, right? So it is, like holy season right now for biblical, like Hebrew based religions, right? So Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are all going through their own, definitive holy season right now. And so I've had the ability to talk a little bit about being an LGBTQ Christian. That's my piece. I've got an LGBTQ Jewish person coming on. And today we're talking about the intersection of being LGBTQ and being Muslim at the same time. And so I'm really pumped, and I have a super cool new friend that we're all gonna get to know each other at the same time here. But I just wanted to point out that at some points throughout this conversation, and in any conversation, all my guests have the absolute right to not feel comfortable answering a question. And that is something that I want to model for everybody who's watching, because it's important that we recognize that it's a privilege to hear someone's story, and no one owes us their story. And so especially when it's a sensitive topic, or, maybe mixed company or something, it's really important that we create a space where people can say, I don't feel comfortable answering that, and the conversation moves on unimpeded. So we're setting up that tenet for this conversation, and it may happen and it may not. But at any rate, we're going to put into practice that idea, and we're going to model it so that we can go out and do it in the world. With that being said, I am going to let my friend introduce himself, and we'll start chatting.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Ale-Ebrahim. I am currently a PhD candidate in anthropology at Indiana University. I am a gay, queer Muslim. And yeah, I'm super excited to get to talk to you all.
Absolutely. I really think it's super cool. I know we talked about this in our pre-conversation, but I really think it's going to be interesting to hear you speak because you do have that educational anthropology piece, which is so fascinating because you have such a diverse history. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about just kind of your social context, your family of origin, your geographic context, all of that stuff that makes Ben Ben?
Sure. So I was born in Wichita, Kansas, and I grew up in Wichita for the first 18 years of my life. I come from a family of mixed heritage. So my grandfather on my dad's side is Iranian, and my dad's Iranian American. He was born here, but my grandpa was an immigrant from Iran in the 1960s. And on my mom's side of the family, I have white American European heritage. And I was raised as a Christian, um, and I went to a fairly conservative Protestant Christian school when I was growing up for, K through 8, kindergarten through 8th grade. And, it's the kind of school where it's super small. evolution is not a thing. Being gay is a sin. So, I realized it's not for me. I ended up going to a public high school and had more of a chance to um, be more open about who I am in terms of my sexuality and think more broadly about religion and spirituality. And in college, I ended up studying Persian language as a way to connect with my Iranian heritage.
Very cool.
And I started learning more about Islam, and I ended up converting to Islam in 2014 while I was in college.
Right
So
on.
that's just a very brief history of me, my background, and my
Right,
religious
like
beliefs.
drinking from a fire hydrant there. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, how old were you when you started to realize that you might be like not straight or different or whatever the words were in your brain?
Yeah. I think in elementary school, I definitely felt different
Yeah.
from, the other boys in my class.
Mhm,
A lot of my friends were the girls. I felt more
mhm,
comfortable around girls. Um, but I did have a sense that like, I wish I had a really close male friend. That's
mhm,
how it was working in my mind.
mhm.
Like I want to be close, intimate with another another male person.
I get that for
And
sure.
looking back, that's like,
Right, right.
yeah. So,
Hindsight, I definitely understand that. I was definitely something that was a part of my narrative in some way.
mhm. So I think that was something I didn't realize that at the time
Mhm.
was my queerness, my gayness emerging.
Yeah, kind of
But
coming
yeah,
to the
definitely looking
surface.
back. Yeah.
Did you when do you know, like, can you look back at a time and think about like this is when I realized what that was, or was it much further after you had come out?
So I don't know if I have a time when I realized that was what that was.
Hmm.
I remember in elementary school, like I was talking with the school counselor, I think it was,
Hmm.
and she was trying to give me hints, I think, about
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
you're gay. But she couldn't do that openly because it was a really conservative school. So, looking back, I'm really thankful for her to planting that seed.
yeah.
But it wasn't until high school, when I was away from that
Hmm.
more religious environment, that I met gay people who were out,
Hmm.
people in my class. I had some gay friends, and yeah, my senior year of high school, I ended up coming out.
Cool.
I realized that I was gay,
Hmm.
and ended up coming out during high school. So that's when that happened.
Isn't it so frustrating that like so many of us are trapped? Like what I like, my family has given me this title, not the unsupportive family, but the supportive family have given me this title of like having been trapped in a glass closet, and I'm like, how was I the last one to know that I was gay? Like that seems like a universal April Fool's joke or something. Like I should have insider insight to that, right?
Yeah, no, it's weird. I don't know. It's a weird experience. I
Hopefully,
thought,
go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I kind of thought that it wouldn't be a surprise when I ended up coming out at the end
Mhm.
of high school. Um, but for my parents, it was.
Yeah.
Maybe not for my friends or for other people in my life, but
Mhm.
for my parents it was, and
how
maybe
did
some
they
friends.
how did they respond? Because it, thinking anthropologically, right, and just thinking about your different parts of what makes up you, like you've got Christianity, you've got kind of Midwestern, you've got Iranian, and was your grandfather Muslim?
Yeah, like officially, but
Yeah,
he's
kind of like
never,
culturally more so
yeah,
than religious. Okay, so you've
exactly.
got you've got a little piece of all of these factors. So how did your parents respond when you came out?
Um, so I didn't I didn't come out on purpose. I remember this was in what, 2011, 2012.
Mhm,
We were watching something on the news about, political debates about gay marriage, same-sex
mhm,
marriage at the
mhm.
time. And I forget who it was, said something, and then I got really angry, like I couldn't stand it anymore. It's like, well, I'm gay too. right? So I came out kind of accidentally in this really emotional way.
Just like,
Um, yeah. So it took a bit of time
hmm
for my mom to be accepting.
hmm
Um, my dad was supportive
hmm
from the beginning, and I think my mom just needed some time. Like
Yeah,
she
just
needed
like
some time to
process.
get to know me as
Yeah,
this different kind of person,
yeah.
um, which was hard at, of course, in the moment. But
Yeah.
like looking back, I can see how it was. She needed that time.
Yeah, looking back, it makes a little more sense. Like I'm a parent now, so there are a lot of things that about parenting that I understand differently now, right? And
Yeah,
especially as a person with, racially diverse and neurologically diverse and queer and gender diverse children. I've got a lot of children, but I understand some things differently. And there's definitely an element to like, no matter how supportive you are, sometimes you just need to like get used to understanding your child in this way. And so I'm glad that it's come back around for you and that there's not still that tension there. But I definitely understand that it's really awful in the moment because you just want people to be like, yay.
yeah, yeah. And I
Definitely.
was having a conversation earlier this week about this, about coming out, and something I heard that stuck with me is, you know, it took me years to figure out who I was, right?
Mhm.
Like to figure out that I can call myself gay, that I can be queer. Um, so it's not super fair
Mhm.
to my mom or
Yeah.
anyone else to just immediately get it,
Yeah.
um, especially if they weren't expecting something like that. So yeah, I think that's something that I've learned recently, and it's helped
Yeah.
me think about my history in a different way.
That's kind of a realization I came to as well. So it's funny because I had the similar train of thought developed in my brain as well. Like, oh, it took me this long. Like, and I'm the one living inside this existence. So I do have to be. Now, this is not okay. So couching this thought with the idea that you never have to forgive abuse and abuse is never okay if that's
Yeah,
what's happening. But it is valid that it could take some time for someone to conceptualize my identity because it took me time to conceptualize it, you know.
definitely.
Were your parents deeply religious? Because you did say you grew up in that Christian environment. So how do you feel that Christian kind of like connection played into your coming out?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say because my understanding of why I was in this school is it wasn't necessarily the conservative Christian
Mhm.
aspect of it. I think my parents wanted to just put me in the school because they thought it was a good education,
Yeah.
and it was, a private school. So I think that was their thinking. And
Mhm.
joining a church, paying the tithe to the church, you get a bit of a discount
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
tuition.
You do.
So
So that's kind of
um,
how it came about for you.
yeah, so
Okay.
like my dad is not really. I don't think he ever was super uh, a strong believer in the
hmm
church. My mom, maybe a bit more so,
hmm
was.
hmm
Uh, she was raised a Catholic, and then I think had her own religious journey and came to Protestantism.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think part of that initial reaction that she had after I came out to her was um, rooted in that
Kind of more
conservative
rooted in
religious
in
perspective.
that practicality, right?
Yeah, rooted in, oh, what does the Bible say, or
Right.
what are people going to think, or
Right.
um, isn't this bad? Isn't it not right? That
hmm
that kind of thing. I think a lot of that came from yeah, having her being a bit more connected to the religion.
Yeah, it's in the holy water. Like there's so much of that that's just baked into the language of church too, and the language of the Bible, and in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but we're gonna use the Bible to maintain slavery and trans people are evil. So there's just like a lot of weird stuff that's inferred in these entrenched church systems. So
Yeah,
Now, so there's like kind of like two faces to your story, right? So we're talking about your coming out journey, but we're also simultaneously talking about you moving to a place where you wanted to embrace your, you know, your heritage in terms of being Iranian, and included in that, you know, some sense of being Muslim. How did that, like, when did that sort of emerge for you?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is coming from me growing up in the early 2000s after 9/11.
Right.
I remember, you know, it wasn't very intense, but some kids in my class would say things like, oh, you know, are you a terrorist or is your grandpa a terrorist? Because my last name is Al-Ebrahim, right? And
Right.
it doesn't look
Right.
like a white person kind of name.
Right.
Um, so I just remember that kind of sense of being different, of being Middle Eastern.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I think high school, college, I was trying to figure out, you know, what does that mean? What does it mean to be Middle Eastern,
Right.
living in Kansas?
Right.
And for me, you know, when I was in college, I had the chance to start studying Persian language, which is
Mhm.
my grandpa's native language.
Okay.
And I spent some time in Tajikistan in Central Asia.
Okay.
Um, I've never been to Iran. I would love to go, but haven't had a chance to do that. So
Mhm.
I think that's where my interest in connecting with my heritage comes from. It's like people are constantly telling me that I'm Middle Eastern and like
Right.
othering me as somehow different ethnically. And so I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Where
Right.
do I fit?
Yeah. Like, I'm so glad you know I'm Iranian. Let me figure out what that means now. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's, I think what's interesting about like a search for sort of cultural heritage, and religious heritage and coming out all at the same time is they're all kind of parts of identity, right? And that's something that I realized about myself as a Christian is like, now, man, I don't even know if I want to claim those motherfuckers, but
Yeah.
I can at the same time disavowing it actually hurts me in some way because I've kind of come to realize that it's my culture. I don't know really what I am. My first ancestry DNA test said I was 98% white and 2% other white. So like I don't really have a strong sense of ethnic background. So
Yeah.
that's my touch point. But all of these things like play into my sense of identity. Did you have any sense of like conflict between the fact that you were like Middle Eastern and that you were gay, or was that not a dissonance that was present for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer.
That's fair.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out
Okay.
now.
That's kind of where you're at
Um,
right now.
yeah, I mean, I I don't want to say that it is in conflict because, you know, knowing um, about queer theory or
Mhm.
anthropology
Mhm.
and, you know, the history of the majority Muslim world, there is a long history of acceptance
Yeah.
for queer identities and practices. So
Surprise.
yeah, and part of what I want to do is you know, connect to that
Mhm.
history. And so I don't want to say that it is in conflict, but
Right.
at the same time, I don't like,
You're still processing very much.
yeah, like I don't go to a mosque because I don't know, it's awkward to like talk about my husband. I don't want to lie and say I'm
Right.
not married or something, but I
Right.
also know that I would get weird looks
Mhm.
if I do talk about that.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at.
It's
Like
kind of all in the sauce for you right now. It sounds like everything's just kind of you're very much still kind of in process of thinking about and working out these things.
I'm so that's part of why I'm working with Hidayah, right? Is
Okay.
this is me building that community where I can
Awesome.
be both Muslim, Middle Eastern, and queer,
Awesome.
because I don't really have that
Right.
otherwise. Yeah.
Would you give, we'll talk about this more at the end, but can you give us just like a Cliff Notes, like 10-second version of what Hidayah is so that folks who are watching know?
Yeah, Hidayah is an organization, a nonprofit organization that was founded in the UK, and we have recently expanded our reach to the US. This happened in 2020 during the pandemic. All of our
Perfect
programming is
timing.
virtual. Our mission is to provide a space for people who identify as Muslim or from a Muslim background and queer, LGBTQ plus in some way, to for it to be a space where they can feel supported, welcomed, and that they have a community, right? Because this
Absolutely.
community is out there. We just gotta create it and do it.
Absolutely. I found Hidayah via a podcast because I realized that being intersectional doesn't happen on accident, especially not when you live where I live, because I live in a super small town in rural Western New York, like 13,500 people declining every day. So I don't run into diversity unless I seek it out very much. Obviously everybody has a unique narrative and I don't want to overlook that. But in terms of demographic diversity, I don't run into it. One of the things that helped me find you was finding Hidayah. And there was actually a podcast about culture versus religion. And that is part of what sparked my understanding of the fact that Christianity was my culture. So I owe that to Hidayah. Also, as a side note, can you let people know what the word Hidayah means?
So Hidayah means guidance in Arabic. So in our context, what that means is, we're here as a space to offer guidance for people who are both queer and Muslim, right? To offer guidance, support, community, a welcoming space.
Yeah, awesome. So we'll put up the contact. For those of you who are watching, we'll put up the information on that later, and I'll drop the podcast links too because they were really, really good for me. I can see how though that joining Hidayah would be you literally fleshing out that connection. Would you mind telling us, if you have, the kind of academic background with it and feel comfortable, would you mind telling us a little bit about the history of acceptance that exists? Because I know that, side note, I've been reading and actually studying in my history of Christian thought, the overlappings of Christianity and Islam, especially like in the 8th and 9th and 10th century, which people don't understand that there was a group of Christians who actually affirmed Muhammad as a prophet, as a messenger of God. People started coming at my head when I posted that on Facebook the other day. So I think it'd be a cool point to drop some of that history if you'd be interested.
Yeah, I didn't hear that before, but that's cool. I'd be interested in learning more about that.
It was Syriatic Christians. I'll send you a link to an article
Gotcha.
after this.
Cool. So I mean, for a long time, the Muslim majority world, Middle East, North Africa, was seen from the perspective of Europeans as the place to go if you were queer. It was seen as a space, and framed in literature as a place where queer identities, LGBT, being gay, being homosexual, was more welcoming than in Europe. So that's part of that Orientalist discourse from Europe. But I think from within the Islamic world, there is a different understanding of sexuality that's not so much rooted in identity as practice. I don't know. So, if you look back to the beginnings of Islamic history, there are several accounts of the Prophet Muhammad supporting gender non-conforming people, for example, in Mecca and Medina, right? Welcoming them into his own household, and offering them protection from other people in the community who were, wanting to prohibit
cause some harm. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there is that history, and then after that initial period, there is a long history of, for example, poetry, Islamic poetry, especially in the Sufi tradition.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of these Sufi poets would use language of same-sex desire to speak about the connection they were seeking to develop between themselves and God
Mm-hmm.
between themselves and the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And so they use the language of, admiring the beautiful men, right?
Mm-hmm.
A beautiful beardless youth.
Mm-hmm.
That was the language of divine connection, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, like yeah, it was
For these
baked
people.
into the connection with divinity, in that strain of thought.
Mm-hmm.
That's so cool, man. I just think it's so interesting how we've all been sold anti-LGBTQ agenda as if it was just gospel truth, pun intended,
Yeah.
but what people don't realize is like for so long, like heterosexuality didn't have to exist until we were trying to decry homosexuality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times from what I've been learning and reading is that in the ancient world, like same-sex behaviors were actually just considered commonplace. And what was like threatening to the system was when people wanted to be in same-sex like relationships. And
Yeah.
that's when we see the creeping in of the idea of heterosexuality and heteronormativity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that same-sex action and attraction didn't exist, it's that it was normal and someone wanted to make it abnormal, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's I think a lot of this similar history in Islamic civilization and Islamic
Mhm.
history, because you have European colonial powers, explorers, travelers
Mhm.
coming to the Middle East and seeing what was relatively a normal practice of
Mhm.
same-sex sexuality, gender nonconformity,
Mhm.
um, and framing that as somehow abnormal, as a point
Mhm.
of difference between Europe and what they were calling the Middle East,
Mhm.
right? Because this was a big part of the Orientalist discourse, again, the colonialist discourse of framing Europe as somehow more elevated than the Middle East. So, like,
Yes.
there is that parallel between this Orientalist discourse of, Europe being superior to the Middle East,
Mhm.
and yeah, heterosexuality being constructed in opposition
Yes.
to what they were calling,
Yeah.
this deviant like homosexuality.
Yeah, there is so much there. This is why I was pumped that you have that anthropology background because you can't I read a dope quote today in my history of Christian thought class, which by the way I go to the coolest seminary. 2/3 of my history of Christian thought class are Muslim, because we actually have my seminary is like the only it hosts the only like Islamic seminary in the United States. It's called Banyan, and so I think it's pretty cool because I actually get to interface with Muslims on a regular basis, and we're dialoguing about Christian history, but like I'm learning so much because they know so much more, well obviously about Islam, but also about like the socioeconomic demographic background of the Middle East, right? It's cool,
Yeah.
it's so cool. But I think that there's so much colonizing has been done, especially with Christianity, and and I say that as an exclusion of Judaism and Islam, because Christianity is this thing like that. All three of the religions started out, in a fairly clustered region, right? But like Christianity has become this thing that people have pervaded as this worldwide norm. And it's been colonized in so many different ways. Do you think there's been a similar, like, has there been a colonization of Islam, or has Islam kind of retained that sort of original shape that that it formed in the geographic area it was in?
Yeah, I think it's complicated.
That's fair. That's
um,
very fair. That was
yeah,
a big question too.
yeah. So, I mean, there are several examples of the religion of Islam being used in the service of colonial projects.
Okay.
I mean, for example, like the Ottoman Empire,
Mm-hmm.
framed it. They had the caliph who was supposed to be the head of the universal Muslim community,
Mm-hmm.
was the same person as the Ottoman emperor.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Okay.
so,
So a little
colonial
bit like
expansion.
Constantine and Christianity for a while there.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. So Ottoman control over the Levant of North
Mm-hmm.
Africa, of the Balkan region,
Mm-hmm.
use that language of religious authority in the service of their, colonial
Mm-hmm.
region-wide imperial project. Um, so that's like one thing. So Islam
Mhm.
certainly has been complicit in those kinds of
Mhm.
imperial projects. As far as it being influenced by the other colonial powers, yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, thinking just about sexuality and gender, um, a lot of these restrictions that you see in the legal regimes of majority Muslim countries in the Middle East
Mhm.
are not rooted in Islam, what Sharia Islamic law,
Hmm.
even though they're framed in that way in some
Right.
cases.
Right.
Actually, these restrictions date to the colonial period.
Mm.
So, for example, in Morocco, where I do my research,
Mhm.
it was the French. It's the French Penal Code
Mhm.
when it was introduced during the colonial period in Morocco that actually criminalized same-sex sexuality.
Okay.
Same thing in Algeria, same thing in Tunisia, in
Okay.
Lebanon, and a similar process with the British
Okay.
region. So, I mean, certainly now,
Yeah.
I think these contemporary states and contemporary religious leaders are blind to that history and framing it as something that's always been true about Islamic societies. Um, that homosexuality is completely unacceptable
Mhm.
and something sinful and should be. It's a example of Western influence. That's just
Yes.
not the case, right? Uh, the colonial influence is the influence of homophobia, transphobia,
Mhm.
right? It's not the source of gender
Yeah.
difference and sexual difference.
I did a colonization 101 episode I want to say maybe like a month and a half ago, because I don't think it's something that I only learned about, I mean, relatively recently in my history, right? But it's something that I've been studying more, right? Especially as I move into my graduate studies. I basically realized I was doing all this reading and thinking anyway, so I should get some sort of piece of paper for it. So it's like,
Yeah.
let's go back to grad school. But I think that there's this insidious nature to colonialism and westernization that people don't understand, because like you're saying there too, like these are influences of colonialism that are specifically traceable to that. But then colonialism in its insidiously weasel-like nature just like weasels on in and convinces people to give up a heritage that was theirs because of
Mhm.
this colonialist ideal. And that is, to use a very scholarly term, bullshit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way I see it is, um, these colonial projects, I'm thinking about Morocco, I'm thinking about Algeria, French influence in North Africa.
Mhm.
Um, a big part of what the colonial state was trying to do was to set up divisions
Mhm.
and simple divisions between people,
Mhm.
right? Making Arabs and Berbers, the indigenous people in North Africa, separate, whereas before they didn't really see themselves as separate from each other.
Mhm. Mhm.
Making Muslims and Jews separate
Mhm.
um, in a
Oh no, I think I lost you.
reflected in this distinction between your sexuality, your as something to be an identity that you have to claim, right? You are
Mhm.
either straight or you're gay.
Mhm.
You're normal or you're abnormal, right?
Mhm.
I think a lot of the colonial influence is saying you have to be pinned down,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
we don't like messiness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, a lot of what I want to do is to go back to that messiness and to reclaim that messiness and say,
Mhm.
um, it's always been there, right?
Yeah.
It's not so simple, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think a lot of that resistance to colonialism is resisting that simplification,
Yeah.
these simple
Absolutely.
binaries.
Yeah, absolutely. As a little aside, there's a book by, I think, Justo Gonzalez is his name, and it's called The Mestizo Augustine, and it talks about Augustine, Saint Augustine, as someone who was a both and person. Like he was essentially of mixed heritage because he had so much loyalty to the Roman Empire, but he was actually practically living and working in Northern Africa. And so that whole Berber conversation is something that I've been thinking about on my own recently from different points, but you might find that book interesting because it talks a lot about those dynamics. And I think a lot of times people forget that the seat of religion in the modern world was in like Africa and the Middle East. And here we are like with like Joel Osteen and the Hillsong churches and, you know, straight white cis, formerly male evangelical cop preachers. That's someone in my town I'm leaning towards. But they're putting this out there as if they have some ownership when they've done what the colonizers do, when they've done what the slave traders did, and they just ripped people out of their heritage and then tried to rip heritage out of people, which is something that Americans love to do, right? and the whole thing was like, we never needed the colonizer. We never needed white people. And I'm saying this as a white person, but I'm speaking of it like on a bigger, you know, on a bigger channel, right? Because even during the Crusades, right, people were trying to kill pagans, you know, they were trying to stamp out that sort of religion. And so it's just so wild how there's such an enmeshment between colonizer mentality and Westernism and, you know, just trying to hoodwink all of us into thinking that we're wrong when really it's like 1% of the population just traveling around and being like, you're wrong because you're different and I'm right because I'm right.
Right. Yeah. You're wrong because you're different from me.
Yep.
And that difference is why you're lesser than me.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I don't think people realize how much that plays into like your psyche is directly shaped by that. My psyche is directly shaped by that. These were not distant historical happenings. These were the bricks that laid the foundation for our own oppression. And here we are, right, as people, as queer people in 2021, trying to figure out who we are because we were walled off from ourselves by outside sources.
Yeah. I mean, speaking about my own family history, like when my grandpa moved here, he married my grandma, who's you know, white American from a small town, and they had my dad and raised him only speaking English. That was a conscious decision because this was in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
You know, the predominant idea at the time was if you have a kid who's bilingual, they're gonna be like not as fluent in English.
Yeah.
Which nowadays, you know, it's changed a lot.
Yeah.
For good reasons, like for good.
Yeah. Yep.
So that like linguistic connection to my dad and my heritage was cut off in that moment because of this idea that you have to pick one, right?
Yeah.
You have to pick either or, English or Persian. So.
Oh, wow, man. I just think it's so crazy because like we're having a conversation about being queer and Muslim, but all of these things play into it. And I think that's what drives me to have these conversations, because there's so many things that are happening, right? In your context. And I think that, you know, you have fantastic insight to offer, because for me, currently I can't, like, in the scant bit of evidence I've been able to find, I can't find when my family wasn't in America. Like, we've been here for a minute from the sounds of it. Yeah. And it's important for people to realize that you are the first generation that was severed from your native tongue.
Yeah, my dad's generation.
Well, yeah, you're the second. So your dad was the first generation that was severed from your native tongue. Right. And like, you can't overemphasize the amount of impact that has to take someone's language from them. You know what I mean? Like, you can't emphasize the displacement that occurs in someone's psyche. You can't. And so in a lot of ways, I think to be queer and religious, especially just to be like perpetually, you know, consummately the religious scholar, which is kind of what I am. Like, I'm academically religious in all senses of the word. Like, it's to continue to push back against that notion of having to be divided, you know, because you don't. You know, you don't.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, even me now, like, I'm in process. I think everyone's in process. We're always in process.
Absolutely.
So like, a lot of what I've been doing for the past couple of years is thinking about, my Iranian background and my
Mhm,
Iranian heritage.
mhm.
That's very important, but I also have a lot of like white European heritage. So on
Yeah,
the one side, my grandpa's moved here in the 60s, and I'm, again, like you were saying, pretty close to that first generation who was in the US.
yeah,
On the other side, through my grandma, through my mom, same thing. Like, we've been here for a long time,
yeah,
settler history.
yep,
So I'm trying to figure out like what it means to be both again.
yeah.
Like, I am white, I am white American, but I'm also Middle Eastern American.
Yep.
So
What
it's
does that mean?
hard
Like,
to
how
figure
does
out.
that play out? Oh man, that's so many things to think about. And I think a lot of people end up feeling cognitive dissonance within themselves, and they never investigate it to get down to that level to see all of those underlying things that are happening within their own identity. Some people
Mhm.
just feel displaced forever, despite, I think this is what you see a lot of people pushing back against white privilege. They're like, well, I'm not privileged, you know what I mean, like blah blah blah, but they haven't got back to their own history. They haven't understood their own identity, and all they're seeing is like, this versus that, when really anybody who's not white in America doesn't have the luxury of not knowing. You know what I mean? Like, doesn't have the luxury of not knowing. You have to think about that if you are simply other than white. And there's
Mhm.
so many undercurrents colliding in that setting.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Now, did you have any so, back to one of the other facets of your identity, did you have any kind of Middle Eastern community, any Iranian community, anything like that when you were growing up, like just demographically?
Yeah, a little bit. I was um, partially raised, like significant.
Mhm.
I spent a significant amount of my time when I was a kid at my grandparents' house.
Okay.
So I would hear my grandpa speaking Farsi a lot
Mhm. Mhm.
when he was talking to his family. I do have some of my family in Texas,
Mhm.
in California,
Cool.
and in my grandparents' neighborhood, there were a couple of other Iranian people that they would come over. They're my uncles, but not like
Right.
biological uncles kind
Right.
of
Right.
thing.
Right. Right.
Um, so there was that, but no one actually of my age. So it was me and my
Okay.
sister,
Okay.
and then my dad and my uncle.
Okay.
Um, yeah, not a huge community, but it was there a little bit.
But you did have that, like, at least like familial kind of community, right? Where you have that experience play out.
Yeah, my family. Yeah, my family was the community.
My partner, my wife Elle, is Puerto Rican. Like, both of her parents were born in Puerto Rico. She's like first generation born in the contiguous United States. I make that
Yep.
distinction because people don't realize that Puerto Rico is the United States still.
Yeah.
But so she's like first generation born in the contiguous United States. And one of the cool things about my kids is, I'll have to show you a picture sometime, but literally every one of them is a different skin tone. We look so diverse in our family. It's wild. But when we go to Elle's mom's house, man, it's tostones, and they're saying things to each other in Spanish, and there's that pride and that identity. And I think that for me, as someone who doesn't have that, like, I think that that's so dope. You know what I mean? Like, even when I was
Yeah.
around my family, we didn't have those sort of traditions that tied us to ancestors and to roots. And so while it's not the same as having a peer community, I think it does still give you at least some sort of like kind of soul level connection to that heritage, right?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, for me, it was a lot of food
Mhm.
at my
Yes.
grandparents' house.
Yeah.
That's probably the strongest,
Yeah.
growing up, the strongest connection I had
Mhm.
to what it meant to be Iranian. We would eat a lot of Iranian food. It's my
Yeah.
favorite food.
Yeah, there you go. I think that that's an interesting connection that a lot of religious traditions draw on, is the idea of coming together over food. Like, obviously, Christianity has the super creepy body and blood of Christ metaphor. Is there a parallel in that to that in Islam, like either like the Eucharist and the body and blood, or some like metaphors over connecting over food?
Um, yeah, not Eucharist,
Okay.
but definitely connecting over food is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
So, looking towards Ramadan coming up in a couple weeks,
Mhm.
every day at sunset you have an iftar,
Mhm.
which means iftar is breaking fast, right?
Mhm.
So Muslims during Ramadan fast from sunrise to sunset, which means no food, no water, no smoking, anything coming in to your body,
Mhm.
unless it's for a medical reason,
Mhm.
is breaking the fast, right? So every night at sunset, having an iftar meal with your family, with your community, is a huge part of what it means to, celebrate Ramadan.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably, yeah, that's certainly a huge thing.
Yeah, so it might not be Eucharistic, but there's still that connection. That was actually my first experience with Islam. Well, it was my second experience with Islam. My first, I actually was able to go to do. I used to work for the newspaper here, and I did a series one year, photographic and writing series, where I went to Passover Seder, Catholic Easter service, and I went to Ramadan at the temple here, and it was so cool. Like it was one of the beginning things that really started to pull me onto this like broader scope of religion than I realized, for sure.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really, really cool. Like, I don't know, you can't be intersectional by accident. Not in this town anyways, and especially not if you don't have that like ethnic diversity, right? So I'm try to force myself into that sort of situation. So
Yeah, that's cool. I mean,
yeah.
also, when I remember going to Tajikistan in Central Asia to study Persian, um, uh, a lot of where I felt that connection to the language and to my host family was, I was there in the summer during Ramadan, and we would eat together every night at sunset. And
Mhm.
now when I'm in Morocco doing research, food is a huge point of connection with me and my friends and the communities I have over there. So
Mhm. How much time do you get to spend in Morocco?
uh, I've been there, I think 3 or 4 times now, like couple months each time doing
Awesome.
research. It's been hard with the pandemic. I haven't traveled at all,
Yeah.
but in the next year, I hope to go back
Yeah.
and do some more longer term research there. Yeah.
Awesome. What sort of research are you doing while you're there?
So my research for my dissertation is looking at LGBTQ communities in Morocco and trying to understand the role of social media and internet technologies in
Mm.
queer life in Morocco.
Mm.
So a lot of what I'm looking at is how do people manage a lot of these tensions that come with these technologies, because they bring new opportunities to connect with different networks of people, queer communities outside the country, within the country, different kinds of visibility,
Mhm.
which at the same time, as it brings connection, it can bring unwanted exposure and
Yes.
danger. And those are sort of the questions I'm trying to
Very
investigate with my
cool.
dissertation research.
Wow. I really hope that you turn that into a book because I would 100% read
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
How far into your research are you?
So I've done a couple of preliminary projects,
Mhm.
and I have a general idea of what I'd like to do, but it's still in the beginning stages.
Right on.
Um, the next step is to spend some more time there, interview more people.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm doing an anthropology program, which means I do a lot of ethnographic research, which is
Mhm.
just like hanging out with people, hearing their stories, trying to understand their perspectives.
Yeah.
So it's really built on the human to human connection,
Awesome.
which has been more difficult over the past year with the
Definitely because of
pandemic.
it.
But yeah, I'd like to spend some more time there. So it's at the beginning,
Yeah.
middle stages. Yeah.
Is there anything that you've like kind of learned or like any observations that you've made? Because obviously you're in the beginning stage, so you can't really say like conclusively, but is there any observations that you've learned in your research so far, or maybe points of things that have challenged you to do, to go further into yourself or something? Anything cool that you could share about that?
Definitely. Yeah. I think one of the biggest differences that I've seen in terms of narratives of queerness in the United States, like dominant narratives of what it means to be queer in the US versus some of the concerns that people in Morocco are having is
Mhm.
the coming out narrative, like the pressure to be out,
Mhm.
um, doesn't mesh well with a lot of people's personal lives in Morocco.
That makes sense.
So what I've seen is people trying to figure out a space to be authentically queer.
Mm.
Um, and they're building these spaces, right? A space to be authentically queer, but it's not built on this sense of I am claiming this identity, right? Because for them, it's politically counterproductive
Mhm.
in some ways. There are some people who are doing that, right? But I think that is maybe one of the bigger differences I see in terms of here versus there, like dominant narratives is resisting this idea that you have to be out, you like the pressure to come out when you know you're gay in order to be authentically gay or queer
Mhm.
or whatever trans. The pressure to be visible, to be out doesn't mesh well there. So they're
That's
trying to, yeah.
That's super interesting because yesterday was Trans Day of Visibility.
Mm,
And I actually made a video that I prefaced with the thought, like, I have the privilege of being out.
right.
I have enough safety. I have enough privilege that affords me the opportunity to be out. But then, as you were talking, my analytical self was like, is it a privilege? Like, does everybody need to struggle to be out and proud, or is it just as valid to be, to be gay in that way that you're seeing with folks in Morocco? Like, that's like an area of privilege, and that's like an area of, like, whiteness and westernness and colonizer mentality that just popped up in my own head. Like, not everybody has to come out and be super queer publicly. Like, that shouldn't be a requisite for your queerness or transness to be valid. And so I made a video along those lines yesterday. But you'll notice that even though I made the video yesterday, I had that, like, colonizer thought pop up today. So that's one of those always in progress things. But I
Well,
do think
I
it's
mean,
valid.
myself, I'm also thinking about this too, because I'm American. Like
Right.
I'm born and raised here. For me, coming out was a big part of who I am, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm also trying to think about what queerness can mean in
Mm-hmm.
different contexts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, yeah. So
It's,
I
it's
think I'm
so
in a
it's such an
similar kind of
interesting
place.
thing to think about. Yeah, I really really hope that we can talk, like, more towards the conclusion of your research. I would love to hear kind of what you learn, and I think the best way to learn is to listen to other people's stories. So that's a pretty dope way to do research, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it is such an interesting point, like, because so we, in that way, we have that area of similarity. You know what I mean? Because the thing about working with intersectional folks is you have similarities and you have differences. So we both have that similarity of kind of this American narrative where your coming out story is almost ubiquitous,
Mhm.
with your queer identity, and it's really easy to use that, as set that as a norm when it doesn't.
Yeah,
It's not necessarily a norm. It doesn't
yeah,
have to be indicative of anyone else. It's just our narrative as Americans, you know?
yeah, yeah. And I think uh, it can be politically useful
Mm-hmm.
or effective
Mm-hmm.
in many contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of the successes of LGBT politics in North America is built on a lot of that visibility of coming
Right.
out to your family and friends and saying,
Right.
"This is me. Do you like? I'm your brother. I'm your sister, right? Like, are you
Yeah,
still gonna
yeah, like
hate me?"
Harvey Milk style, like, you've got to call your family, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think what people are trying to say is that is not the only effective political strategy. So one example of something I've seen is shifting the language
Mhm.
from coming out to inviting people in. Like,
Ooh.
who do you invite into your space?
Mm.
Um, and you can be more, I think that kind of language makes it seem like it's not some secret that you're keeping,
Right.
right? It's, I'm inviting the people I want to be in community with, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Wow.
something I've seen that I think is super interesting.
That's incredibly interesting. I'm gonna be thinking about that like all day. I'm gonna be like cutting hair, and I'm gonna be thinking about like inviting people in, huh?
Right.
Because you know what the coolest part of that is, and even with the narrative of coming out, not everybody has agency in their own coming out story, but
Yes.
you retain your agency when you choose to invite someone in.
Right.
And perhaps maybe retaining your own agency might be something that would be incredibly valuable to people,
Definitely. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
so interesting. This is a good conversation. I could like talk all day about this stuff. So, alas, I do have to work, unfortunately. Like this will pay the bills one day, but not yet. So, so if you don't mind, I always wrap up with 2 questions. The first one's hard. The second one is easy. So we'll do the hard one first, and then we'll do the second one. The second one's just going to be, can you give us your contact info and Hidayah's contact info, and we'll get at that. But my first question, the harder one, is if people could only take away one thing from this episode, video, recording, podcast, whatever, if people could only take away one thing from this, what would you want to say that people could take home? And we've had the gamut of answers from like drink enough water to like really deep shit. So the floor is yours, whatever you want to put out there.
Yeah. I think the one thing I would want people to know is that there's not one way to be any kind of identity. Like there's not one way to be Muslim. There's not one way to be queer. And there's not one way to be American or man or whatever. I think what I want to encourage people to do is to think creatively, be kind to yourself, and resist a lot of that guilt of I'm not whatever enough. I'm not practicing enough. I'm not being out enough. Because where you're at, that's where you're at, right? And you got to be kind to yourself. So
yes, that's so perfect. I don't know if you can see on my face, but I got the word grace tattooed on my head. And I actually got it for that reason, because when I came out, there was homophobia baked into my being. Like I was both gay and gay hating, you know what I mean? And I wouldn't have expressed that hating part to anybody else, but because it was me, no one can ever be meaner to me than me. And so I think that's so funny that you said that, because it really speaks to something that I've been trying to work on. There's no one way to be anything. I don't owe anyone anything. And I just need to be me and be happy and have grace for myself on the days that like me is subpar, because it's me, you know what I mean? Awesome. Man, I'm gonna think about this all day. I swear, I'm so hyped up right now. So to close us out though, could you provide us with any way that people could get in touch with you or your work, or Hidayah? If you can just let people know that'd be amazing.
Yeah, definitely. So you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Ben Ale-Ebrahim, BenAleBrahim. And then Hidayah. We have an Instagram page. If you search Hidayah LGBT, you will be able to find us there on Instagram.
All right. How do you spell Hidayah for those who might not be
sure? Hidayah is Hidayah.
I put you on the spot right there. So yes, and I'll put these written links in the show notes and in the comments and everything. So I have to say thank you so much for your time. This conversation would have been exciting if you were like simply Muslim and LGBTQ, but the fact that you're doing this research and you have this anthropological background and you have such a diverse background yourself made this like a mind-blowingly great conversation. So thank you for bringing your full self and all of your complex parts to the table. I know that it definitely made an impact on me, and I hope that it makes an impact on everyone else who watches. And I expect to hear from you when this PhD work is like getting towards that middle to end stage, because we're gonna have to set up another date.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Leo. It was great to talk to you. And I hope we keep having these conversations.
Absolutely. You have a great day, friend. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This has been Conversations. Come back next week, and please remember that everybody has a voice at the table. Have a good night, everybody.
This has been the Conversations podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to get involved, feel free to join the conversation on social media. You can find us at Conversations Official on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to rate, follow, and share this podcast. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.